So as we push on with this history of ecclesiology, we now make it into the second Christian millennium with really a tragic event, and that's the schism of East and West. And this is one of the two great wounds to church unity in our history. This is where the Church of Rome, the Western Church, the Catholic Church, split from the Eastern Orthodox, a wound that remains until today. And this is an enormous question of both theology and history. We can't possibly do it justice here. So just to note a few points, part of what was at question in this split was a question of authority in the church. So there's a couple of things for us to note here when we're talking about ecclesiology. Is first the relationship between East and West, the wound to the oneness of the church, but then this question of ultimate authority within the church. In the West, there was an alteration in the Nicene-Constantinopolitan Creed. So that is our creed that we profess at Mass, that creed that came from the 4th century. And in the West, under the authority of the Pope, that was altered to include the Latin phrase filioque. So when we profess at Mass that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, that and the Son was not originally in the creed. It kind of gradually worked its way into the creed. It was added in the 6th century in Spain and gradually gained acceptance in the West. But this raised not only a theological question about the Trinity, but for our purposes here, the question of authority in the church. The East said that the West had, in particular the papacy, had no authority to change a creed that was ratified by an ecumenical council. And the West, and again particularly the papacy, said, no, we do have that authority to do that. And that's a disagreement that remains until today. And it's a discussion we'll have to have, and it's going to come up again in this history, is where does the fullness of authority lie within the church? Is it with the Pope or with a council? A few other things historically happened. The 9th century Patriarch Photius of Constantinople came into conflict with Pope Nicholas I and denied papal supremacy. So in the East, they're now, especially with Photius, is out and out denying papal supremacy. So you can see the rift growing. And in 1054, the split between East and West became concrete, became official, when there was conflict between the papal legates to Constantinople and the Patriarch Michael at the time, and that resulted in mutual excommunications, which were only lifted actually under, even though the schism remains, the mutual excommunications were only lifted during the time of Pope St. John Paul II. This rift was, I don't know if you would say solidified or exacerbated by the Fourth Crusade, which the West came and ended up sacking Constantinople, and the East really never got over that fact. There were some attempts at reunification, both at the council of these ecumenical councils at Lyon in 1274 and Florence in 1439, but the East simply never recognized those attempts at reunion. Another point that we have to look at is Pope Boniface VIII in the late 13th century. And Pope Boniface VIII is another one of these steps in the solidifying of the authority of the papacy, but also provides something that, again, in ecclesiology, a rigorous ecclesiology, is going to have to address in his papal bull Unum Sanctum in 1302. This was provoked by King Philip IV of France. So you see these dialogues and these conflicts with secular leaders. Because of this conflict, the Pope said that the temporal power of the state, right, the secular power of the state, could only be wielded at the command of and with the permission of the church. So you see the church becomes a secular ruler, the Pope becomes a secular ruler, and now is actually saying he's over the power of the state, and in particular France. And the way this was phrased in Unum Sanctum is, quote, "Furthermore, we declare, we proclaim, we define that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff," that is, to the Pope. Now, this doesn't say actually much beyond what St. Cyprian said and St. Augustine would say, and what the Council of Florence will say in the 15th century, that the Catholic Church is necessary for salvation. But again, especially after the discovery of the New World, in the 15th century in particular, where we know of all of these human beings who had no possibility of ever having been a member of the Catholic Church. What do we say about salvation? So again, this is one of those topics we'll discuss. We just noted it at this time. We can move on. Another major event had to do with the Avignon Papacy and the Great Western Schism. At the insistence of Philip, in 1309, the papacy was transferred to Avignon, where it remained until 1377. That is to say, for about 70 years, the papacy wasn't in Rome. It was in France, and this had all kinds of it made for all kinds of problems having to do with the interference of the state, particularly France, in papal matters. Well, in any case, this is important for us because it contributes to the Great Western Schism, which luckily wasn't permanent like the Eastern Schism, but this is the time period in the late 14th, early 15th century where famously we had at one time 3 major claimants to the papacy. People often say there were 3 popes at the time. That's in no way accurate. But there was a lot of uncertainty for, what was a matter of, 30, 40 years on who the pope was. If you were a Christian during this Great Western Schism in the middle of it and you were born into it, you would have your claimant to the papacy, but there were 3 claimants at one point. Well, again, why this is important to our study is how was this settled? It was settled by the Council of Constance. An ecumenical council was called in Constance to resolve the crisis and proposed more frequent meetings of the church councils. So what happens is the Council of Constance deposes the different rival claimants to the papacy and establishes who goes on to be the Pope. What the question this brings up, and they suggest that councils should meet more frequently. I forget if it's every 1 year, 2 year, 5 years. I'd have to look. But this starts to bring back this question, who has ultimate authority? Can an ecumenical sit in judgment over a pope? Well, it seems at this council that they certainly did. They deposed these claimants and elected the pope that became the pope from there on in. Well, this council of Constance said that an ecumenical council, by representing the church in its entirety, enjoyed authority superior to that of the Pope alone. And this is the rise of what's called conciliarism. Conciliarism enjoyed a history all the way into the 19th century. There are some rumblings of it even into the modern day. This idea of the Ecumenical Council of Constance was never accepted by the Pope of Rome, even the Pope who was established by them. But what this shows is an ongoing tension between the papacy and the ecumenical council. And this rise of conciliarism was one extreme of that the councils alone enjoyed supreme authority in the church. Again, this is a question we'll have to ask today. And if you don't know the answer to this, it actually might surprise you. Who has ultimate full authority in the church, a pope or a council? So stay tuned for that. We can move on briefly to the Protestant Reformation and Catholic Counter-Reformation. Obviously, the Protestant Reformation challenged many points of the understanding of the church. Luther saw the church, rather than a visible hierarchical body or juridical body, Luther saw the church as essentially that invisible congregation of those who have justifying faith. So it's more of a moral or spiritual unity than an outward juridical existing reality. For the Protestants, the scriptures in particular hold authority above and often over and against the papacy or councils. So in his fight against the church, Luther eventually says the Pope and councils in particular have erred and rejects their authority for the authority of Scripture alone. And a core of the Protestant Reformation was the rejection of the concept of the church as a clerical hierarchy that mediates salvation. So that means when the church responds, it's going to be responding in terms of the challenge. So it's going to be affirming that the church is a clerical, hierarchical organization or organism that mediates salvation. So at the Council of Trent, you get the reaffirmation of the hierarchical authority of the church. It reaffirms the 7 sacraments, including ordination, which was under challenge from the Protestant reformers. And the Council of Trent also included many, many reforms, including the establishment of seminaries to form priests. One of the major figures that came out of the Catholic Counter-Reformation is the Catholic Saint Robert Bellarmine. He's probably the most influential ecclesiologist until the 20th century. In fact, his idea of the nature of the church was the dominant model up until the verge of the Second Vatican Council. And we'll see that when we look at the models of the church, how he was so influential on the question, what is the church? But because Protestantism had attacked the visible structure of the church, Bellarmine made the structure of the church the focal point in his defense. So there's kind of a polemical edge to him. He's responding to these challenges. So he says, quote, "The church is the community of men brought together by the profession of the same Christian faith, conjoined in the communion of the same sacraments, under the government of the legitimate pastors, and especially the one vicar of Christ on earth, the Roman pontiff." Now notice how all of those things, the church is defined by things that are outward and visible. Profession of the same faith, an outward profession, right? Not simply holding the same faith, but profession of the faith, the sacraments, which are outward realities, and the legitimate government of the pastors, particularly the Pope. So this is juridical, it's hierarchical, it is visible. So the response is particularly in defining the church in response to the Protestant challenges. As a visible society, the church, therefore, could be compared it's an analogy to the Kingdom of France or the Republic of Venice. It's an outward organization. It's in Latin the societas perfecta. It's a society that's Latin. It would be perfect society. But it doesn't mean perfect in the sense of perfect in goodness or anything, but having within itself all the means necessary for the attainment of its ends. Just as France does or Venice does, so does the church. It's a society having everything in it that it needs. So there's a stress on visibility, right? And that left little room for other notions of the church like mystery or sacrament or communion, things that will arise more or be rediscovered in the 20th century. Let's move into the early modern period with Gallicanism. So as the papacy is more and more asserting itself and more asserting itself in matters secular, Gallicanism, which has begun in France, is a response to that and a reaction. That is in opposition to ideas that were called ultramontane. Ultramontane means across the mountains, across the Alps, and we can talk about that later. So you have on one hand Gallicanism and on the other hand ultramontanism. So ultramontanism affirmed the authority of the Pope over the temporal kingdoms of the rest of Europe, right? So this is, you see this in Boniface VIII, right? That the temporal kingdoms can only exercise their power at the behest of the papacy or with the papacy's okay. This emphasized the supreme episcopate for the Bishop of Rome holding universal and immediate jurisdiction over the entire church. So ultramontanism is a stressing of the authority of the Holy Father and the authority of the Pope, sometimes to too great of a degree. Right? So you even hear that word ultramontanism used sometimes today in different circles. Well, Gallicanism tended to be the opposite, to the opposite extreme, tended to restrain the Pope's authority in favor of that of the bishops and the people's representatives in the state, particularly the monarch, right? So you have on one hand the authority of the Pope, ultramontanism, and this other downgrading the authority of the Pope, submitting it to the monarch. That's Gallicanism, particularly in France. Later Gallicanism affirms the freedom of the French monarchy from papal authority altogether and asserted the supremacy of church councils over the Pope and rejected papal infallibility. So you see Gallicanism brings up conciliarism again, and Gallicanism is summed up in what are called the Four Gallican Articles around 1682, which, by the way, were condemned, as you might imagine, by Rome. So this is another back and forth or interplay that continues to happen is to what degree does the Church of Rome have authority? And so that's a question that we'll take up in our class as well. In our next video, we'll get into the 19th century.